Quick, think of an Xbox exclusive franchise. Got it? Okay, now how many of you thought of either Halo, Gears of War, or Forza? Oh, all of you. Literally every single one of you. Alright, you know what? That's great, actually. That proves my point exactly. All my life, I was raised to be an Xbox kid. I played the original at my cousin's house when I was in elementary school, I got a 360 for Christmas when I was in middle school, and I wanted an Xbox One throughout most of high school. Which is why, when the 9th generation of home consoles rolled around and I finally had enough money for a new system, I joined the dark side. Of course, all my friends were still hardcore Xbox supporters, but fortunately they were very understanding and respectful of my decision. But why though? After years of playing these games, using this controller, getting used to this interface, why make the switch? Well, how else am I gonna play knack? Exclusive games are arguably the most defining feature of consoles, and it's been no secret that Xbox is lacking them as of late. They've acquired a ton of developers over the years, and do release various timed exclusives and one-off titles, but when you say Xbox exclusive game, there's a reason people only think of these three. Out of all Xbox-owned franchises, the only ones that have been around for at least 10 years, consistently get new entries, and have always been Xbox exclusive titles, well, you can count them on one hand. There's simply not enough quality and variety within Xbox's library of games to satisfy most gamers, especially those who are forced to choose between one platform or the other for any given generation. They may be trying to build up their repertoire, but to say that the results have been mixed, that's an understatement. However, it wasn't always like this. Long ago, when the Earth was flat and the world was in black and white, Xbox was but a fledgling brand trying to compete with the gaming juggernauts that were PlayStation and Nintendo. They needed a way to draw the attention of consumers and get them to forego Luigi's Mansion and Final Fantasy X, so they started pumping out exclusives like it was no one's business. And, largely due to a certain space shooter that needs no introduction, it worked. Sure, they didn't sell anywhere close to PS2 numbers, but for a newcomer, they got a pretty solid foothold within the home console market. But it does beg the question, what happened to these games? How did these series evolve? How were they received, and what caused Microsoft to give them the axe? Well, I'm glad you asked. Allow me to show you what used to be. Here are some of Xbox's deceased franchises. It's by no means a definitive list, just some of the ones I thought were interesting, noteworthy, or at least was able to find footage for. Of all Xbox exclusives that never got a follow-up, Crimson Skies is the most baffling to me. It started as a board game of all things, before being adapted into a PC title that got ported to arcades, but the entry that defines the series is High Road to Revenge, released for the original Xbox. Now, I'm no expert on the genre, but I have played a good few arcade flight games, and High Road to Revenge is easily my favorite. Fun characters, a good story, really solid visuals, and an awesome alternate history setting that explored Dieselpunk before Dieselpunk was even a thing. It's not a true open world game, but it does have large levels and an open-ended mission structure. And of all games from this era that give you this much freedom, Crimson Skies is arguably the best one that isn't titled Grand Theft Auto. It wasn't a bestseller per se, but it was critically and commercially successful, so many fans jumped to the logical conclusion and began anticipating a sequel. And 20 years later, we're still anticipating. Come on, people really liked Crimson Skies. It's maybe not the best thing ever, but it got good reviews and it's consistently seen as one of the must-have titles for the original Xbox. It would give Xbox a defining series and a firm grasp on a genre of games without significant competition. It's not like the developers suddenly went defunct or Microsoft lost ownership of the IP. It's almost like they just forgot it ever existed. That's just tragic. Though it's been a while since the heyday of snowboarding games like 1080 and SSX, it doesn't make the genre any less cool. Anyways, Amped. A launch title for the original Xbox, Amped focused on exploration-based gameplay within the game's various resorts and mountains, rather than the much more linear levels of its competitors. It didn't get the greatest reviews, but it still sold pretty well. The uniquely open gameplay helped set Amped apart from others in its genre, and ultimately gave Xbox enough reason to make a sequel. Amped 2 was a departure from its predecessor in that it was based less on exploration and more so on Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, featuring a variety of professional snowboarders in realistic realistic courses with various goals to complete in each level. It was a part of Xbox's XSN series of sports games, which, aside from going defunct after a single year of operation, united a variety of Xbox sports franchises under a single banner. So it does make sense that they decided to go in a slightly different, albeit still realistic direction for the series with gameplay that adhered to more traditional takes on extreme sports games, and it largely seemed to work out for them. Not only is Amped 2 generally considered to be the peak of the series, but also just one of the best snowboarding games ever. It only made sense to continue the series with Amped 3, which was an even further departure from the previous two games given its irreverent tone and absolutely nonsensical story mode. God, the 2000s were weird. It wasn't as warmly received as the previous two, but it still did well enough. It was far enough from an outright negative reaction to avoid prompting anything drastic, like canceling the series. So, for 2K's next trick, they canceled the series. In 2006, while Amped 4 was still in development, the studio behind the series, IndieBuilt, was abruptly shut down, and the series hasn't seen the light of day since. As for why Microsoft decided to abandon the series there, well, I can't entirely be sure. I mean, as far as I can tell, 2K still retains the rights to the Amped name, and it's not like there was any formal announcement regarding the series' end. If any one factor is to blame, it was probably the declining sales of the series, as well as just snowboarding games as a whole. But it probably doesn't help that Amped is just a really weird series. It doesn't really have a definitive entry. Sure, 2 is generally considered the best, but all games in the series received comparable critical reception despite being pretty unique from one another. In fact, aside from being a more relaxed alternative to SSX, I'd even go so far as to say that Amped doesn't even have that strong of a series identity. Between those two factors, Microsoft likely figured that trying to pick up from where IndieBuilt left off simply wasn't worth the effort. I'd love to see Microsoft return to Amped someday, though even if it does happen, I feel like there's no telling what kind of snowboarding game we'll get. It's just that kind of series. Without a doubt, Project Gotham Racing is one of the most iconic and influential arcade racers ever conceived. It's most known for bringing about the kudos system, where moving on from one race to the next isn't just determined by your placement in the race, but also the amount of tricks you perform along the way, encouraging a healthy balance of road safety laws being violated. The track list took you on a brief tour across the globe, featuring courses based on various cities and their landmarks, and creating a world of legalized urban street racing for you to partake in. It's not overly deep or complex, it's just simple arcade racing fun. And that's honestly what made it so great. In a time where Ridge Racer and Gran Turismo were the dominant racing games on home consoles, Project Gotham not only gave Xbox an exclusive to call its own, but a respectable and rather unique foothold within what was at the time a very lucrative market. For years it was a staple of Xbox consoles, receiving entries on both the original Xbox and the 360, and always landing solid reviews from critics and fans alike. But similar to Amped, the series continually sold less and less with each entry, despite constant improvements and additions to the gameplay formula. No doubt due in part to the critical and commercial success of games like Need for Speed and Xbox's own Forza Motorsport. Eventually, the developers' bizarre creations were bought out by Activision, announcing that Project Gotham 4 would be the last game they developed for Microsoft, with Microsoft retaining the trademark to the series. And that was really the last we heard out of Project Gotham. Given that it's been over 15 years since, it's likely we aren't getting a new entry. Microsoft doesn't seem to have any interest in reviving the series given the continued success of Forza, and Bizarre Creations was dissolved in 2011 after their spiritual successor to Project Gotham failed to meet sales expectations. In hindsight, it was just time for the series to go. It may have been a classic formula, but people were ready to move on to bigger and better things. Still, its influence on the racing genre is clear to see, even today. For such an iconic title, it feels like a pretty ignoble way to go out. Though not as popular as Halo or Gears, Crackdown offered some variety in Xbox's shooter space. Where other shooters focused on gritty campaigns and competitive online multiplayer, Crackdown's gameplay is much more relaxed, featuring an open sandbox map, arcadey gunplay, environmental destruction, power-ups, vehicles, and overall it just invokes the spirit of comic books and superheroes, which itself is accentuated by thick outlines for character models. The fact that it's heavily influenced by GTA is blatant, but it's far from a straight-up clone. It's got plenty of its own style, places far more emphasis on co-op, and in some ways tries to supersede GTA. The first Crackdown title is a classic, definitely one of, if not the definitive sandbox shooter. Problem is, it's been 17 years, and despite having 2 sequels, Crackdown 1 is still the definitive sandbox shooter. Crackdown 2 released in 2010, notably without the direction of the series' progenitor David Jones, who's also known for such classics as Grand Theft Auto and Lemmings. Perhaps it was due to Jones's lack of direction that Crackdown 2 was consistently criticized for lacking innovation, with reviewers stating that it was fun, though that was more so an effect of the solid core gameplay established by the first game, rather than any changes made by the sequel. Crackdown 3 was set to release in 2016 with Jones back at the helm, but 3 years of delays and Epic Games' acquisition of CloudGen in 2018 once again left the series Jonesless. Crackdown 3 also received middling scores and was similarly criticized for not really adding anything new or innovative to the Crackdown formula, aside from Terry Crews, of course. Given that it's been only 5 years since the most recent entry, it doesn't feel right to kill off the series just yet, and of all games we're going to talk about today, Crackdown feels like the title that's most likely to make a return. Still, it's hard to deny that Crackdown's design is outdated, to say the least. I want to say there's a market for it, though I think that's only if the series finds a way to push the genre forward, and quickly. Otherwise, yeah, it's dead in the water. What Mario is for Nintendo and Sonic is for Sega, Blinx tried to be for Xbox, and considering we're talking about it right now, it's safe to assume it didn't turn out well. Blinx is an action platformer whose main gimmick is time manipulation. The story takes you throughout world B1Q64, really rolls off the tongue, as you try to save its princess and defeat the evil Tom Tom gang, who obviously are a group of biker pigs, a cat's natural enemy. You get 10 minutes to complete each level, which involves defeating enemies and collecting time crystals. Upon collecting a set of time crystals within a level, you gain one of 5 different types of time control, including slowing down, speeding up, reversing, pausing, or recording a segment of time. Blinx offers a unique take on a popular family-friendly genre, and had pretty solid visuals for the time. It definitely had the potential to be Xbox's flagship franchise. However, despite the developers trying to push it as such, at least in Japan, people just did not like this game. Blinx was consistently met with middling reviews. People called it repetitive and tedious, or just flat out criticized the game's execution, particularly the controls. It still sold okay, but not nearly enough for a game that's trying to become the franchise for an entire video game platform. Nevertheless, Microsoft did greenlight a sequel, which aimed to supersede the original in almost every way. Blinx 2, Masters of Time and Space, adds character customization, a versus mode, and a secondary storyline that allows players to control Tom-Toms in stealth-based gameplay. With a massively scaled-up single-player campaign and the addition of multiplayer, surely this would be the entry that cemented Blinx as an Xbox staple. Surely. Blinx 2 underperformed as well. It didn't bomb per se, but like the original, it was met with pretty middling reviews, and it sure as hell didn't meet sales expectations. 1 mediocre game might not kill a franchise, but 2 probably will, especially if you're barely averaging 300,000 copies sold with each entry. That just ain't gonna cut it for old penny-pinching Microsoft. We all know they don't have any money to spare on these experiments. Blinx couldn't be the mascot for Xbox, but at least he lives on as the mascot for one of my favorite Twitter accounts. Let me put this on the record right now. Steel Battalion is hands down one of the most ambitious video games ever created. It is at this point that most people ask, Dray, what in the hell is Steel Battalion? Mech Simulator. For the original Xbox. This thing. These graphics. These TVs. Mech Simulator. Now, I don't think simply calling this thing a mech simulator really explains how out there this game is. Just so we can establish a baseline, let's take a look at a modern mech game and see how it plays. This is Armored Core 6, a mech game that wouldn't feel too out of place in an arcade. The high freedom of movement strongly contributes to faster-paced missions, and the high number of customization options available to you means there's a wide variety of strategies you can employ to tackle said missions. My point is, the unrestrained feel of Armored Core's gameplay creates a game that is action-packed, fast-paced, and easily approachable. Now let's take a look at Steel Battalion. At the start of a mission, you must start up your mech by pressing a series of buttons in the correct order. If you press them out of order, your mech stalls and you have to start over. If you're traveling and you try to take a corner while moving too quickly, your mech will topple and you have to start over. If you use your boosters too much, your mech will overheat and your operating system will shut down, and you have to start over. If you take too much damage and fail to eject from the cockpit in time, your mech will explode, your character dies, the game deletes your save data, and, you guessed it, you have to start over. Did you get mud on your windshield? Well, those windshield wipers aren't going to turn themselves on. Like I said, mech simulator. As you can probably imagine, everything about this game from missions to gameplay is rather meticulous and complex, and controlling your mech is no easy feat. Speaking of which, controls. Here's our modern mech game again, and it controls about how you'd expect it to. Its arcadey gameplay allows you to easily control your mech with a standard controller. Each button has a purpose, and all are easily accessible. Very simple, very natural. In Steel Battalion, your controller looks like this. I'm starting to see why this game didn't do well. In hindsight, this one is obvious. I mean, as blatantly awesome of an idea that this is, even what did get released is clearly far too ambitious. Even at the time, people didn't really know what the hell to make of it. GameSpot thought it was a really great game. They also thought it was a really bad game. It lacked accessibility, it was in a really niche genre, and even though the original Xbox is known for big controllers, there's no way your average gamer has room for this absolute hoss of a battle station. It would be a surprise if this game did sell well, and considering its only follow-ups were an online-only expansion and a sequel for Kinect, I'm almost shocked the series didn't die sooner. What? What do you mean I can't talk about Viva Pinata? Not an Xbox exclusive, how? So what if there's a version for the DS? It's Viva Pinata, it's an Xbox classic. Well, who cares if it's not technically correct? It's not like anyone watches these videos anyways. No, you know what? You are not doing this to me again. It's my video, I'm gonna talk about Viva Pinata, and you're gonna like it. Viva Pinata! The original was released in 2006 for the Xbox 360, and on top of being a pretty solid life simulation game, is also the only video game that's ever made me ask, why does a pinata need human teeth? Both ideation and development came courtesy of Rare, and it's very clearly a project that they themselves were passionate about, rather than something that Microsoft forced them into making. Between the visuals and bright color palette, Viva Pinata feels very at home with many of Rare's older titles, which is something that critics seem to make note of. It was specifically praised for those aspects, as well as its deep and expansive gameplay and the wacky charm that Rare's games seem to have in spades. To this day, it's regarded as a cult classic, and it received enough critical and commercial success to spawn several sequels, as well as versions for Windows and, yes, the Nintendo DS, so the series isn't entirely exclusive to Xbox. Whatever, sue me. Save for the party game spin-off that also happens to be the only Viva Pinata game not developed by Rare, all the Viva Pinata games were pretty well received, and both the original and its direct sequel Trouble in Paradise were included as titles in Rare Replay. Unfortunately, that's about all we've heard out of Viva Pinata in the time since the aforementioned DS title. Even though sales-wise, Viva Pinata didn't exactly do poorly, it was around this time that Microsoft started shifting their focus to the casual crowd, primarily through the development of Kinect. Rare is one of Microsoft's most valuable developers. They can't be seen working on games that'll barely crack 500,000 units sold. They need to be working on real projects like Kinect Sports and Xbox Live avatars. Yeah. In hindsight, Viva Pinata is one of the least Xbox-feeling franchises that Xbox has ever Xboxed, and alongside the unfortunate timing of Xbox's change in marketing strategy, that's probably why it got shut down. I find it ironic. Microsoft shut down a casual franchise so that Rare could work on a casual franchise, albeit one that was Microsoft mandated. They didn't seem to understand that Rare's best work typically comes about when they're left to their own devices. Honestly, Rare is just such a fascinating company. I'd love to do a deeper dive into their history, but that's for another day. If you ask most gamers my age about From Software, they'll likely tell you that it's the company that makes the Souls games. Maybe they'll say something about Armored Core, but more often than not, people act like this company didn't exist before the year 2009. Like Rare, I would very much like to do a complete overview of the company's almost 40-year history. But for now, Otogi. First released in 2002, Otogi Myth of Demons is a third-person action-adventure game where you play as an undead warrior attempting to fight back waves of demons in classical Japan. I feel like I've heard this one before. Otogi was set apart from other action-adventure games by its darker atmosphere, especially its eerie lighting and enemy design, and yeah, this is all sounding pretty familiar. It was also noteworthy for its somewhat higher difficulty. It had heavy RPG elements, magic and health that could be difficult to replace if lost, and combat that was slower and more deliberate when compared to other hack and slashes. Okay, I know I've heard of a game like this before. Ooh, I got it. Odama. No wait, that's the pinball one. Both Otogi and its sequel were pretty well liked critically. The visuals and atmosphere in particular were almost universally lauded by critics. In terms of gameplay and presentation, Otogi brought a new flavor to the action-adventure genre, especially as an Xbox exclusive. Commercially though, yeah, this series was about as successful as an ice salesman in Finland. Nobody bought these things. The first entry only sold about 130,000 units, whereas its sequel didn't even sell half that, making it one of the rarer and more valuable games for the original Xbox. Of course, I think what's most striking about this series nowadays is that, on paper, it has a very strong resemblance to the Souls games. I mean, it's an action-adventure game by From Software, that alone should be a red flag, but even if you look deeper than that, the story, the atmosphere, the combat, the bullshit, it's really not that difficult to see Otogi as a Souls prototype. Yes, with sales numbers like these, it's kind of hard to justify continuing the series, but with sales numbers like these, I do wonder what would have happened if they had. It's just weird to think that one of the biggest influences for one of the biggest game franchises in recent memory may have been a couple of duds for the original Xbox. If Bill Gates told you that his favorite video game was a party game exclusive to the original Xbox, would you want to play it? Yeah, me either. And thus we have Fusion Frenzy, which is exactly that. An Xbox exclusive party game which does away with the board and focuses exclusively on the minigames, pitting up to 4 players against each other either mano a mano or in teams. Players are awarded orbs based on their performance in each game, which they can either turn into points or wager for even more points through this game's shtick, the aptly titled Fusion Frenzy round, where players have to transport the wagered orbs to their goal, while maybe trying to steal orbs from other players too. At the end of each round, the collected orbs are turned into points. Player with the most points wins. I'm no party game aficionado, but this wagering mechanic seems to be pretty unique to Fusion Frenzy, and that's on top of it being an excellent way to introduce your children to gambling, right alongside Poker with Luigi and Lucky 7 scratch-offs. On the other hand, the overall lack of a board means Fusion Frenzy is much more skill-based than other party games, which, for a party game at least, I consider to be suboptimal. The element of randomness and opportunities for bullshit are kind of what make other party games fun. It's what gives the person who has no idea what they're doing just as much of a chance of winning as the most seasoned party game veteran. I don't think that's what killed off Fusion Frenzy though. See, the game received mixed to average reviews upon release, and while it didn't sell poorly, Microsoft wasn't exactly hovering their finger over the make this a mainstay series button either. What Fusion Frenzy needed was a definitive follow-up, a sequel that would refine the more simplistic elements and give the gameplay more depth, that would maintain the game's unique art style and expand upon the futuristic urban setting. A sequel that would cement Fusion Frenzy as more than just another generic party game. Yep, that'll do it. So, Xbox's dead exclusives. Sure are a lot of them. Like I said, this was not a definitive list. There are plenty of other deceased Xbox exclusives that I could talk about. NFL Fever, a Microsoft-developed alternative to NFL 2K and Madden. Galleon, an action-adventure game from the guy who designed Lara Croft. Cyanide, a 3D interpretation of traditional 2D shoot-'em-ups. Or Quantum Redshift, a spiritual successor to Wipeout. I could even get into the really obscure stuff, like NUDE, a Japan-only life simulation game, which apparently is such an enigma that price charting doesn't even have an estimated value for it, and Wikipedia can't tell me anything other than it exists. But even with the few series I did research, I was honestly pretty surprised by the variety of genres that Xbox has gone for in the past. I'll probably always identify Xbox as the shooter machine, but it's cool to see how at points in its history, Microsoft was pumping out some pretty capable party games, life sim titles, sports and racing games, arcade flight games, RPGs, and way more. We may not think of it as such, but Xbox was, at that time at least, a very competent platform with a rich variety of exclusives. And even though that hasn't really been the case for some time now, I'd love to see Xbox branch out again and hopefully find success in other genres. Yes, they've been trying, and yes, they haven't really been succeeding, though while I love pushing for innovation within the game industry and am optimistic that they'll eventually strike gold with a new IP, I would really like to see the revival of some of their older ones. Let's face it, we are in peak revival hours for titles from the late 90s and early aughts. I mean, the Switch has been absolutely thriving on old content. The Doom and Ratchet & Clank reboots have done really well. We got remakes of Battle for Bikini Bottom and fucking Pac-Man World of all things. Twisted Metal got its own TV show. Like, who is making the decisions for these companies? So yeah, I'd love to see Xbox take a swing at reviving its old franchises. I may be a PS5 owner, but man, I would kill for a new Crimson Skies. A new Amped would be really neat, or an open world take on Project Gotham. I would love that. If Xbox wants to revive one of their old exclusives, now's the time to do it, and I think they're aware of that. Fable, which I completely passed over earlier, is another classic Xbox exclusive, an action RPG with an awesome fantasy setting inspired by medieval Britain. The last mainline entry was released in 2010, and the developer Lionhead Studios was shut down in 2016, so it'd be understandable if people assumed the series was dead. And yet, in 2020, we got an announcement for a new Fable game, being headed by Forza Horizon developer Playground Games, with the first in-game trailer coming out at last year's Xbox Games Showcase. I'm not saying I have the highest of hopes for it, but I still want it to do well, and if it does, then maybe that'll be the push Microsoft needs to greenlight more of these revivals. We'll see. In the meantime, though, I'm more than happy to play through some of these Xbox classics. I can confirm that there's some great stuff hidden away in your Game Pass subscription, though unfortunately not all I've discussed today is included. Speaking of which, now that I've looked into it, honestly, I am really curious about playing Steel Battalion, especially given its wonky-ass control setup. I just gotta try it for myself. Let's see how much it's going for. I mean, original Xbox games are usually dirt cheap, so it's probably like, what, $10? Damn it.
Yo, he coming. He coming.
Whoa.